Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. I'm Kim Strassel. I'm here with Kate Batchelder-Odell and Joe Sternberg. Chinese leader Xi Jinping and Russian President Vladimir Putin met Tuesday in Moscow in what clearly seemed to be a summit designed to deepen economic and political relations between Moscow and Beijing. Both leaders en passant denounced what they describe as a U.S.-led geopolitical order and have called instead for a more multipolar world in which they play a more dominant role. China's been buying Russian oil to help Putin buck Western sanctions. They are expected to sign a new declaration of economic cooperation. But it seems to me that this really puts on the table the potential for very heightened East-West tensions. Kate, what do you think was driving Xi Jinping's decision to make this the first foreign trip of his third term, an unprecedented third term? What are Russia and China hoping to get out of this?
Well, Kim, we've already seen some, like you said, some economic deepening of ties there, and certainly both of them want to trade with each other, and especially on energy and other things like that. But I think we should really focus on the larger stakes of this meeting, which they're being quite upfront about, which is to challenge the American order. Americans are used to living in a world where, for instance, the seas are calm and people don't invade their neighbors. And Russia and China are suggesting a new type of world that looks much different, where American power doesn't have as much influence on world affairs and where they can exert influence on their neighbors through coercive means. So this is a challenge to the U.S. in ways that I don't think that America has dealt with since the 1980s. And I think, practically speaking, a couple takeaways from this meeting is one would be that China is not an honest broker on Ukraine. We've seen China try to kind of come in and say, well, we're here with an objective view and we'll try to negotiate a peace deal. I think this really shows that that's not a good faith offer. But I also think we are living through a sort of a bifurcating of the world. We also have Iran working with Russia and China, Iran providing weapons for Russia to use in Ukraine, some discussion of expanding weapons productions in Iran. So we're really seeing the world kind of bifurcate into these categories. And just pair that quickly with the Japanese Prime Minister's visit to Ukraine today. Japan has planted itself on the U.S.'s side of this dispute as they try to increase their defense spending. So overall, Kim, I think this is a tough picture of a world that's becoming a lot more volatile and sort of sorting in new ways that we haven't seen in decades.
Yeah, a new global world disorder. Joe, there doesn't seem to be any question that this is a big problem. And what has struck me is I've seen a number of the so-called foreign policy experts ruminating in recent weeks about the potential failure on the U.S.'s part and the West's part to have done something to avoid this, to have exercised more diplomacy. But, I wanted to ask you if you actually think that is something that's a reasonable critique. If I go back, I think I remember the Obama-Biden Great Reset with Russia. The United States, I think, largely turned a blind eye to a lot of Russia's aggressions, going all the way back to its belligerence toward Georgia, its first invasion of Ukraine, its ties with Syria. And on China, it seems like so much of the tension that's been growing has really come out of China's belligerence, its anti-democratic move in Hong Kong, its aggression toward Taiwan. I mean, is this something we could have avoided, or is this just the way it was always going to be?
Well, I definitely think there's a U.S. policy failure at work here, but it's not that one. So, as you pointed out, what this critique is arguing is that somehow if we had made more of an effort to be besties with China or with Russia, they wouldn't be cultivating this friendship with each other. I think that it is more accurate to say that both of them, plus Iran, for their own reasons, have been developing a real hostility to the U.S. and the U.S.-led order. This is especially noticeable in China, where Xi Jinping has been pushing the Chinese economy more toward decoupling almost since the very beginning of his tenure back in 2012. Certainly, Russia under Vladimir Putin has not acted as if it were keen to cultivate closer ties with the U.S. So for their own domestic reasons, they were nursing a hostility to America. I think that the failure of American diplomacy and also potentially of American military deterrence is that we did not create sufficient disincentives for them to become friends with each other as they are acting out this emerging hostility that they each feel toward the U.S. individually. That can take the form of a sometimes vacillating response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine or previous Russian invasions of its neighbors, including Ukraine in 2014 or Georgia in 2008. That kind of apparent weakness created the impression that maybe the U.S. wasn't really committed to that. It might have allowed China to think that Russia could be a useful partner in terms of distracting or somehow weakening American resolve. It wasn't that we needed to try to be friends with regimes that were never going to be friendly to us. It was that we failed to keep them from becoming friends with each other.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more on that, Joe. It seems to be a lot of this is a failure of a defined policy response in so many situations. Don't forget all the way back when Joe Biden was taking us out of Afghanistan. One of the reasons was supposedly so that we could focus on China. And yet, I think even those foreign policy experts who've been actually fairly tolerant of the Biden foreign policy would acknowledge that there really is no defined foreign policy there. And Kate, I think last question here, but I think that gets to a broader failing as well, too, which is just American neglect, as it were, of its own standing and military power. I keep asking myself, would we really have seen Vladimir Putin invade Ukraine if Vladimir Putin hadn't first watched the spectacle of that chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan? Putin moved almost immediately afterward, no doubt inspired by a belief that a Joe Biden who was unwilling to see things through in Afghanistan would probably be unwilling to do anything in Ukraine. By the way, that was a good bet. So for a long time now, starting with Obama, continuing on, we have neglected our own military defenses, really sent the message that we are not going to do anything out in the world or as much as we could. What do you think that has played in terms of a role?
I think that's played a huge role in the growing disorder that we're seeing now. I think we're getting at two things, one of which is we are lacking the will to do anything. And so we see our withdrawal from Afghanistan looked so feckless and awful and not the behavior of a great power. So that is a question of credibility. Are we really going to do anything? And that's why it's so odd, Kim, every time Joe Biden heralds his Ukraine policy as such a success. I'm glad he's giving them weapons, though not enough. But keep in mind that this started because Joe Biden was calling it possibly a minor incursion, and we were taking our own assets out of the country, and we basically signaled that we weren't going to do anything about it. The other thing I just add quickly, Kim, is that our conventional military deterrent has been shrinking over the past years. And just a core example of that is the U.S. Navy, which has struggled to keep up in the Pacific. And also, it's not just the Pacific. I mean, we kept a destroyer in the Black Sea about more than 200 days a year before 2014. And our ships are just so busy that we haven't been able to be the cop on the beat everywhere around the world, discouraging bad behavior. So that decline of hard power paired with an unwillingness to do anything, I think has been really a true part of the story and the disorder we're seeing now.
Yep, I think it's an enormous part. And we're about to get a view here, too, as to whether or not the new House Republican majority is going to try to do anything about this as they get ready to put together their budget resolution, whether they can pass one, and whether that resolution both does take a little bit of an axe to domestic discretionary spending and tries to put a little bit more of it into a defense budget that very much needs to be increased. Thank you, Kay. And thank you, Joe. We also thank our listeners. We want to remind you that we are here every weekday. We'll be back tomorrow. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button.